Hello and good morning. And today on our TV show we have Tom Hanley, Chief of Police, and he's going to talk to us about terrorism.
Hi, Betty. Another cheery subject.
Yeah. Yes. It's people are not sure what the term means and what it is, and how we think about things.
Terrorism is a term that's very often misused and misunderstood. There's a difference between the word terror and terrorism. In other words, if somebody walks into a local store with a gun and scares somebody, that's terror. But that's not terrorism. Terrorism is essentially a legal term, and it's got some very specific definitions, and we have to determine before a person is prosecuted or you investigate it as a case of terrorism exactly what it is that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Terrorism usually involves some sort of unlawful use of force or violence. It's perpetrated against persons or property or the government with the goal to intimidate the government or the population or any threat thereof for political and social purposes,
Mm-hmm.
political or social purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't meet that definition, then it isn't terrorism. One of the things we see are school shootings that we've had,
Mm-hmm.
some in the past several years. Those are generally not acts of terrorism, though we like to think they are, because they're scary,
Mm-hmm.
and they create a lot of...
Terrible.
They're terrible things, but that's not terrorism,
Uh-huh.
okay? There's
That's,
a real...
what would you call that, then?
Those are criminal acts. You know,
Criminal acts.
most of these things are against the law, period, the end, whether it's a mass murder
Mm-hmm.
or assaults or any of that, a bombing. These things are... There's the criminal statutes that deal with these, and these are
Mm-hmm.
acts that are crimes and not essentially terrorism. You really have to look at an act to see if it fits that full definition of terrorism. Is it to further a political or social goal? Is it to intimidate the population? You really have to have that kind of a checklist.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about terrorism, we talk about things that are propagated currently by ISIS, or what their real name is. It's called Daesh. That's their acronym for what they call themselves, DAESH, as opposed to ISIL or ISIS. Acts where they're trying to further some sort of political agenda or social
Mm-hmm.
agenda. What the Ku Klux Klan used to be involved with back in the 1800s and mid-1900s, that was terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
To try to keep a segment of the population intimidated, to try to maintain some sort of social order. That was terrorism. If we look at Columbine, that was not terrorism. And you may think that, well, it's either the same thing. Somebody went in and killed a bunch of people,
Mm-hmm.
innocent people that weren't enemies or any of that. But again, it boils down to the legal definition. And a case like Columbine or the school in Connecticut or some of the others, those are, I don't want to say simple, that kind of diminishes the effect, but these are crimes. There's
Mm-hmm.
statutes. They wouldn't prosecute somebody like that for terrorism.
So for terrorism, you have to be doing it with the background and trying to prove yourself in the political arena or social.
Trying to further or some
Yeah.
sort of social goal, or for a social goal, and try to intimidate or coerce a government.
Mm-hmm.
When we looked at Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh put the truck bomb there and
Mm-hmm.
killed 200 and some odd people there. Was that an act of terrorism or was it a crime? We tend to look at that because that was specifically related to intimidation of the government. That was related to some sort of separatist type movement. So
Mm-hmm.
we would classify that as terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's the difference in the penalties?
Well, if it goes as a federal crime generally if it's terrorism.
Uh-huh.
It's prosecuted federally, and there are fairly significant penalties. I mean, the
Yeah.
death penalty is the death penalty. It doesn't matter what it is. But it also allows the government to investigate a little bit differently if it's an act of terrorism,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's perpetrated by a foreign entity.
Mm-hmm.
We have two types of terrorism, domestic and international terrorism. Domestic terrorism follows the same definition, but it's generally perpetrated by somebody within the country that is not receiving outside foreign aid for that.
So they're not connected to ISIS or something.
They may be inspired by them or motivated by ISIS, but not specifically connected to them, so it wouldn't be international terrorism. That would be considered domestic terrorism.
Uh-huh.
And we've seen some of that recently where in Philadelphia just over the weekend, where that person went and shot a Philadelphia police officer, claimed he was inspired, he was doing it, he was muttering Allah Akbar and some of the other things, and he was doing it on behalf of ISIS. But that does not look like it's going to be international terrorism generated within this country by somebody in the country at the time, and without getting any kind of foreign aid.
How does one become radicalized?
You know, that's a question that comes up. How do we see some of these folks that have been involved in terrorism or planning terrorism within the United States? How do they get that way? We had one young man on Long Island, came from an upscale Long Island family. He was Catholic, raised a Catholic. He was an altar boy. And within a few years, he was planning to blow up a subway in New York City, providing Al-Qaeda at the time with information on subway schedules, how to get in. He went overseas, got some training. He was going to come back and detonate a device on a subway. How does that happen? So we have to look at what the process of radicalization is, and it's a multi-step process. The first part of the process is somebody becomes detached, a disenfranchised person who's got a grievance against something, and generally becomes withdrawn from the normal things that they are involved with in their life. And in doing so, they begin to adopt an ideology, and they'll find that ideology anywhere. If you go on the internet, there's plenty of things you can become involved with, plenty of different ideologies you can adopt. And usually it ends there. In his case, he went to the third stage, which is called mobilization. And he actually started talking in military terms, planting destructive devices. And there's a lot of material out there that allows people that are disenfranchised, people that, for whatever reason, become loners, and they gravitate toward this sort of ideology. With ISIS and Al-Qaeda, there are two publications that are on the internet, regular publications. One is called Dabiq Magazine, and the other is called Inspire Magazine. With Dabiq Magazine, this is the more recent one that we see from ISIS, and very glossy. They're very good with social media. They're very good at coming up with attention-grabbing pictures. And the articles in there provide somebody that's disenfranchised or has become disenchanted with society itself reasons to become radicalized. This article talks about the U.S. killing women, children, and the elderly during its occupation of Iraq, American soldiers executing families and raping women, Muslim families killed under the broad definition of collateral damage, and on and on and on. It talks about James Foley, who was the aid worker who was decapitated by what they call him, Jihadi John over there, and decapitation was published on a lot of media. They justify that in here. They talk about that if a mujahid, which is what they call the person that did this, kills a single man with a knife, it's called a barbaric killing of an innocent. However, if Americans kill thousands of Muslim families all over the world by pressing missile fire buttons, it's called collateral damage. So you can see how somebody can read this stuff and be convinced that, wait a minute, we're the bad guys. What are we doing this to these people before? They're already disenfranchised. They've already lost that kind of connection. And what happens is during that alienation process, their alienation is supported by other people on the internet, perhaps other people they meet somewhere, chat rooms, where their growing opinion, their growing attitude is endorsed by others. So that is their social connection.
So they like the people that are talking to them, and so they go along with them.
They have, they can see how that their grievances are mutually shared among others, and it is endorsed. Another magazine, internet magazine, is called Inspire Magazine, and this was published by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This was actually started by an American who became radicalized himself and went to Yemen, where his fluency in English helped him publish this magazine. And it's a very glitzy magazine, very glossy, a lot of pictures. So the articles are very brief. But again, it talks about the evils that the Americans do and talks about the Americans in pejorative terms. Not a lot different than we talk about Al-Qaeda and ISIS in pejorative terms. We use the term terrorist to refer to things that ISIS does and what the Ku Klux Klan used to do and some of the other groups. We refer to them as terrorists. They don't refer to themselves as terrorists at all. They refer to themselves in other terms, freedom fighters.
Freedom fighters.
They refer to us as crusaders, which is a pejorative term. Obviously, going back to the history where the Crusades went into the Middle East.
Yeah.
They threw the Moors out of Spain. They went to the Middle East to fight the Muslims. So crusaders is a pejorative term when you get to the Middle East. We kind of look at it as kind of a lofty term. Even some of our cartoon heroes are called crusaders.
I don't think it was very lofty.
But anyway, we're called crusaders. And they refer to us in all their publications as crusaders. They never refer to themselves as terrorists. They reference in their publications how we call them terrorists, but then they point to all the things that they claim the Americans are doing and say, well, that's terror. You're the real terrorists. We're not the terrorists. We saw that over the years in the 60s when the Americans were called imperialists. Vietnam, Central America, the Americans referred to by a pejorative term as imperialists. That was the manner in which they inspired people to go against us. And we saw it even with our own Americans who became alienated, who became sort of disenfranchised, referred to our own country as an imperialist country. And if you remember in the 60s, you saw a lot of that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this kind of terms going back and forth, and understand where these terms come from. We call them terrorists. They don't call themselves terrorists. They are engaged in what we commonly call asymmetrical warfare. Now, if you want to know what these folks are doing, asymmetrical warfare is what we kind of term the conflict we have with ISIS, because we're not engaged in a conflict with a state. In World War II, we fought Germany, we fought Japan, we fought Italy for a little while, some other countries. Symmetrical warfare, us versus them, territory, topple that government, replace it with a government that's more friendly with us. They were aggressors, we fought that aggression. Everything is fairly simple to define. It's difficult to define this now because it's not about territory. It's about culture and about ideas. And there is no way that ISIS isn't going to engage the United States Army in a set-piece battle and prevail in that sort of battle. They can't do it. So they engage in a practice, what they call is death by 1,000 cuts. Small actions, try to inspire people that are alienated and aggrieved within this country to commit acts of what we call terror, what they call asymmetrical warfare against Americans here. The death by 1,000 cuts theory is that eventually, while they will never beat us militarily on a field of battle, the Americans will get tired of it and just withdraw from the Middle East and withdraw their influence from ISIS, from the Middle East. Their base grievances go back a lot of years. Al-Qaeda's beliefs were they just wanted Western influence removed from the Middle East. They wanted to create a caliphate, a larger, I think they call it the Greater Caliphate, Northern Africa, the Middle East, the Southern Mediterranean, and create that as their Islamic caliphate and rid that area of Western influence. Western teaching, Western influence, American, French, German, English influence in that area. One of the other groups that's active in Africa, Boko Haram, is quite specific about that. And I think their name, when translated, has something to do with Western influence is evil or something like that. They want to rid the area of Western influence and create their own caliphate. So it's more a clash of ideas than it is a clash of territories, whereas Germany in World War II was looking for living space, and they had a lot of their racial things. They wanted to rid the area of Jewish people. They wanted to rid the area of
Christians?
Not so much Christians, but because most of the Germans were Christians anyway. Hitler was.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted to rid the area of inferior races, Slavics and things like that. They wanted to take the Ukraine and the breadbasket that was, make it part of Greater Germany. You saw territorial ambitions and to be a large, powerful country. These people have less territorial ambitions than they do in creating an Islamic caliphate, and the United States stands in their way.
We're the only nation that stands in their way?
Well, as you read this, you'll see that they've got some real gripes against the French. Some of these most recent actions are based on the French involvement in Libya a few years ago. It's not hard to figure out what they want to do because everything is printed in these two magazines. If you read them, and they come out periodically. Every couple of months you get a new one that comes out. I don't subscribe to them. I don't get them in the mail.
Well, sometimes, you know.
They're available openly on the internet. I mean, I just printed these down from going on the internet and pulling them down. There's nothing secret about this. If you want to know what they're about, if you want to know what the state of some of these Islamic folks are about, just read what they write. They unashamedly print what they're all about. They tell you what they're going to do. One of the articles, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I said one of the articles in the first Inspire magazine was an article entitled "How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom." You know, obviously aiming this at younger folks. How to make a bomb in your kitchen out of commonly held materials, and then how to detonate the bomb. This particular Inspire magazine talks all about setting booby traps, how you don't have to engage the enemy or get caught. It's titled, "Are You Ready for an Ambush? Following simple instructions, you can carry out a lethal ambush. There is no retaliation to face. Just place and vanish." It has a little picture, talk about blowing up cars in parking lots, all kinds of things that they are trying to take our alienated folks to do. And it's not all young people. A few years ago, a woman from Texas, 50 years old, she's got the moniker Jihad Jane. She was going into some of this radicalization, where she was going to go to Sweden and carry out some of Al-Qaeda's missions out there to kill officials in Sweden. So it's pretty frightening stuff. I think it's important that we understand what they're all about.
Yes.
Know thine enemy. They are a sworn enemy of the United States.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. These people want to hurt people in the United States. They don't have anything personal against anybody, but we are a different culture. They don't agree with our culture. They would like to destroy our culture, or at the very least remove the influence of Western culture from the Middle East and their greater North Africa, their greater Islamic Caliphate area that they want to start.
But some of their ideas are like, don't seem to mind killing people, and they treat women like slaves, and they capture women to be slaves.
Yep.
And that's what some of the teenage girls go over there. They think they're going to get married and they're going to help these people. They're slaves, sex slaves.
In many cases, they are. We just have to understand they've taken the Quran, their holy book, and I'm not an expert on this, and I don't want to talk out of school about this, but the Quran tells them how to live their life. Every aspect of their life, the Quran tells them how to live. They are very opposed to democracy because they view democracy as something that's man-made and created by man, invented by man. And so they're opposed to democracy, and they'll tell you that. It's in their writings. What they want is just to follow the precepts of the Quran, but some of that has been taken out of context.
Oh, yes, that bit has been taken out of context. I know
To keep
that.
the powerful in power.
Yeah.
And so it's been corrupted.
I even read the Quran one time about 4 years ago,
Yeah.
5 years ago. I kind of forget what was in it, but
Right.
I mean, they say you're going to go to heaven, so kill yourself, and they put the guns. I mean, all the stuff on them to kill other people, and then they just pull the trigger and they're dead, and everybody else is dead. How do you get that?
But remember what these folks are. These are not people that are sociopaths. They're not psychopaths. They're not crazy people. These people have bought into this ideology. This is their ideology. This is their belief. This is the glasses through which they see the world. This is what they believe in. And what happens is you can't treat them like a bunch of crazy people. They're not crazy. They are very committed, very dedicated to their cause, and they believe fervently in what their beliefs are. So we have to understand that. This is not a group that you can negotiate with. You know, we look at the difference between a conflict that NATO engages in and a conflict that, say, ISIS engages in. And there are some significant differences. For NATO operations, there's a beginning and an end. There's an objective. NATO targets strategic and tactical targets. They don't target civilians, although Do civilians get hurt? Yeah, because people put these targets within the civilian population. It's regrettable. They don't intend to kill civilians. They're not trying to intimidate civilians. ISIS is not that. They want to intimidate civilians. That's why they do this. They want to scare you. It's death by 1,000 cuts. With NATO, there's always the belief in a negotiated end to a conflict. We can negotiate this. We can talk, we can have peace talks, we can negotiate a conflict. ISIS, there is no negotiation. It's our way or death.
Because they're interpreting the Quran, and I mean, I've talked to my husband about it a lot. He's gotten into this in some way, and you know, when he reads things about the Quran and stuff, it isn't what they're doing.
Right, I know. It's been corrupted for these people's purposes.
Yeah. And I mean, the way they treat women, and there was a story about a 12-year-old, you know, when he was going to rape her, and so he prayed, and then he raped her, and then he prayed, and he was told that this was not an evil thing to do because he did it in the right way.
I'm sure there's a lot of anecdotal and a lot of historical stories like that that go on. But basically,
terrible.
It is. We just have to be prepared for this. We have to. We're not concerned that ISIS is going to get an aircraft carrier and send waves of people here to invade the United States. They can't do that. They won't be able to do that. But what they can do is, through these publications, through the use of social media, try to find alienated people that are here, that are that they can convince to commit attacks against the United States. The Tsarnaev brothers in Boston a few years ago. There's these two that were out in California, Pasadena, a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And there have been Americans, I mean, that aren't of Middle East descent that have bought into this. The one I talked about on Long Island and a couple of others. It's death by 1,000 cuts. The more they can hurt us, intimidate, coerce, and scare us, the more they'll accomplish what their mission is to rid the Middle East of the United States.
It must be France also and others.
Well, France, with the raid France did on Mali a few years ago, with the aid that France gave to Libya in deposing Gaddafi, some of the operations France has done there, they've now become an enemy of the ISIS group as well, which is why we're seeing Charlie Hebdo, which some of the most recent one a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, was that November, I think, with the shooting that occurred there.
Yeah.
With they killed 100 and some odd people, or more than that. I don't remember the number, but it was a lot. They've specifically targeting France, and it's not a surprise. It's written right in here in the Beak magazine, as well as Inspire, where they're talking about how they're going to get France, how they're going to get England. And they take advantage of the democratic ideals in our country, which protect our civil rights from unwarranted intrusion by the police. Look at all the problems with the NSA, with the FBI, with the CIA, some of the practices with the Patriot Act. They know that the Americans, the democracy that they hate, they can turn around and use it against us because they can have these lone wolves in there, act with complete impunity, because the government just can't come in and crack down, which they can do. Which they can do in ISIS. ISIS doesn't have these sort of freedoms that we have here. So they like to turn that against us.
Now, one of the other questions is, what about our area and terrorism?
You know, we just have to keep an eye on that. I mean, it comes down to individuals to protect yourself. Many of these people now, since we're not engaged in an overt conflict, anybody that becomes disenfranchised, alienated, can fall into this trap of harming Americans. And that could happen as easily in Middlebury as it could in Bristol, as it could in Pasadena. Generally, these attacks are designed to attract a lot of attention. So they target the more urban areas. Also where they can operate in areas where they wouldn't be seen or picked up. Middlebury is a small community. People have their eyes open here in this town. If something was scary or something out of place, strange smells coming out of an apartment, somebody detonating explosives to practice, somebody would come to the attention of somebody, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But we just have to keep our eyes open. I know we're in tune with all the the security apparatus here in the state with the state police and the FBI, get frequent bulletins on what to watch out for, what are trends coming in, what are some of the things to look out for. But it all comes down to that alienated, disenfranchised person that doesn't rise to the level of us. Communications on this used to go through chat rooms, and the FBI used to monitor chat rooms, so they could pick up on some of the conversations that were open to anybody to get into. And the FBI would sometimes get into the chats themselves, posing as people from Al-Qaeda or Somalia or from the Middle East or somewhere, and they could identify people that were threats and then take action against them. That's been curtailed somewhat. Everything evolves. The tactics they use evolve. They're not using chat rooms as much anymore. They're telling people don't use chat rooms. You can monitor this stuff, but don't tell anybody about it. Don't talk to anybody. Don't tell your mother. Don't tell your best friend. Stay isolated. So they're not rising to the attention of anybody. They're not coming up. That young fellow in Long Island got into a few chat rooms. They were able to pick up on his chat with people in the Middle East. They were able to follow him all the way to Pakistan, watch what he was doing in Pakistan. When he came back to the United States, he was arrested. It was fairly easy. There was a number of those cases where that happened. But by and by, you know, terrorism hasn't harmed a lot of people in the United States over the past few years. More people are killed annually in traffic accidents, medical malpractice.
And guns. Other kinds of guns.
All kinds of weapons, fists, everything. I mean, we lose 30 to 40,000 people a year in traffic accidents. These are the things we need to be worried about. You know, drive carefully, be on your alert. We don't have terrorists lurking behind every corner, but we've got some bad drivers out there that do. There are a lot of things that kill Americans, that terrorize us. Terrorism is way, way, way down at the bottom of that list. It's just something to be aware of.
That's interesting. Yeah. So we have about 1 minute or half a minute if there's anything else.
That's it. Just be on your alert. Be aware of this. It's going to be a problem that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. But again, there are more common everyday things that are going to hurt us more than terrorism is. Okay. Just be careful.
Just be careful. Well, thank you very much. And I hope you, I don't know if you enjoyed this talk, but it is a very good, informative discussion. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, Betty.
Thank you.